At my daughter's wedding, I reached for the chair behind me, but before I could sit, it was yanked away. My body hit the polished floor with a crack so loud it silenced the string quartet mid-note. Gasps rippled through the hall, but then came the laughter, scattered at first, then louder, feeding on itself. And above it all, my daughter's groom, Derek, smirked down at me. "Your place is on the floor, old man," he sneered, his voice cutting sharper than the marble beneath me. I clenched my jaw, not from the pain, but from the humiliation. My hand braced against the floor, my shoulder aching, but the worst wound was knowing strangers were laughing while my daughter stood frozen with tears brimming in her eyes. Before I go further, let me pause and say, if you're listening to this story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now let me take you inside that wedding, inside the moment where everything changed for me, for my daughter, and for the man who thought he could humiliate me in front of the world. I didn't lash out, I didn't shout. Years of discipline taught me better. I pulled myself up slowly, each movement deliberate, like a man refusing to stay down no matter how many times life knocked him over. My knees burned, my hand throbbed, but my dignity remained intact. I straightened my jacket, brushed the dust from my trousers, and locked eyes with Derek. His grin faltered when he realized I wasn't broken. I was standing. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, ashamed of their own laughter. Others pulled out phones, their screens glowing as they recorded what they thought was nothing more than wedding drama. But I knew better. This was no accident. This was a test, a challenge, and Derek thought he had won. I glanced at my daughter, Claire. She stood at the end of the aisle, bouquet trembling in her hands, white petals slipping from her grip like snow. Her face was pale, her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at me the way she had as a child, when she scraped her knees on the playground, when she lost her mother, and clung to me as if I could keep the world from collapsing. In her eyes, I saw shame, confusion, and a desperate plea. I gave her a small nod, the kind of nod that says, "I'm fine, and so will you be." Because even in that moment, I refused to let her see me broken. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he tried to steer the ceremony back on track, but no one was listening. All eyes were on me, on Derek, and on the silence that filled the grand hall. The chandeliers above glittered coldly, casting sharp light on faces that now looked less entertained and more unsettled. I took my seat again, this time pulling the chair forward myself. The scrape of wood against marble echoed like a warning. I didn't look at Derek. I looked only at Claire, giving her the strength she needed to keep standing at that altar. The ceremony stumbled forward, the words of vows and promises spilling out like hollow rehearsals. I heard none of it. My mind drifted back to a different chair, a wooden one I had built decades earlier in the garage. Claire was 6 then, small legs dangling, eyes wide with curiosity as she watched me tighten bolts and fix engines. She had wanted a chair of her own beside mine, so I built her one, sanding it smooth until my hands blistered, painting it blue with leftover porch paint. That chair wasn't much, but it meant everything. It was hers. It was dignity. It was belonging. And now, years later, a chair had been ripped away from me, not by accident, not by fate, but by the very man claiming to love her. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, the guests clapped hesitantly. Glasses clinked. Music rose again, soft and controlled. But beneath the polished celebration, something darker lingered, a tension no champagne could wash away. I sat quietly at the far table, my place card tucked away near distant relatives and strangers, a deliberate move to keep me far from the spotlight. I didn't mind. I never craved attention. But tonight, attention had found me, and Derek had made sure of it. As waiters weaved between tables with trays of wine, Derek leaned in close to his friends, whispering words I couldn't hear, but I could see the smirk on his lips, the glances cast my way, the laughter too forced to be natural. He thought he had reduced me to a joke. He thought he had claimed victory with one cruel stunt. What he didn't know was that men like me, men who had built their lives with their bare hands, who had buried wives and raised daughters alone, who had endured pain, without complaint, we don't stay on the floor. We rise. Always. But there was something else, something unexpected, that shifted the air in that hall. Boots. Not polished shoes or soft steps, but boots crossing the marble with steady, deliberate purpose. Guests turned, heads swiveled, and then the sound stopped. A man stood at the entrance, his tie askew, his suit fine but worn like an afterthought. His eyes swept the room until they landed on me. His face went pale, his lips parted, and he whispered words that froze me in place. "Sir, is that you?" The wedding had just changed, and none of us, not Derek, not Claire, not even I, could have predicted what would follow. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Sir, is that you?" The man at the doorway froze, his eyes locked on mine. His voice cracked, trembling, but carried through the hall with a force that silenced even the whispering guests. I blinked, unsure if I was hearing correctly. It had been decades since anyone had spoken to me like that. For a moment, the polished marble, the chandeliers, the wedding flowers, all of it faded. I saw dust, sand, smoke, the flash of tracer, rounds across a night sky far from home. I heard shouts, commands, the ragged breath of men fighting to survive. And there he was standing before me again, older now, grayer, but unmistakable. The hall remained still, every eye darting between him and me, waiting for an explanation that never came. Derek's smug grin faltered as his father, because that's who the man was, the groom's father, stepped forward with a steadiness that betrayed years of discipline. His polished shoes echoed like the boots of old, but I knew that gait, I knew that stance. A soldier never forgets another. His voice cracked again, softer this time. "It is you." He took another step closer, his hand trembling as if reaching for a ghost. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, their laughter forgotten, replaced by curiosity and confusion. Claire's bouquet slipped from her hands entirely, roses scattering across the floor as she looked between us, her lips parted, her face pale with shock. I didn't move. My fingers curled against the tablecloth, gripping it tight enough to wrinkle the fabric. Memories I had locked away for years clawed to the surface. Nights spent crawling through dirt, carrying a man on my shoulders through fire, promises whispered in desperation. His eyes, back then, were wide with fear, his voice hoarse as he swore he'd never forget. And now here he was staring at me across a wedding hall, as if fate had dragged him back into my life. The officiant stammered, his voice faltering as he tried to regain control of the room, but no one was listening anymore. Conversations had stopped. The band had lowered their instruments. Even the waiters stood frozen, holding trays midair. The silence was oppressive, thick enough to suffocate. Then the man whispered again, louder this time, his words carrying weight far beyond their sound. "Sergeant." I inhaled deeply, steadying myself, my hand brushing against the chain beneath my shirt where my late wife's wedding ring still rested. My chest tightened as I finally rose from my chair, slow and deliberate, every motion filled with meaning. My knees ached from the fall, but I stood tall. Taller than Derek, taller than humiliation. The hall watched me, with breath held. And in that silence, I gave the smallest nod. The man's face crumpled, his hand going to his mouth. He staggered back a step as though the past had struck him in the chest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Derek's smirk collapsed. His eyes darted between me and his father, confusion giving way to something sharper, panic. He muttered something under his breath, too quiet to catch, but his posture stiffened like a boy caught misbehaving. Claire's tears finally spilled, glistening under the chandelier light, as she reached for my arm. Her voice trembled. "Dad, what is this? What's happening?" I couldn't answer her. Not yet. My voice would have broken under the weight of everything pressing in. So I stayed silent, letting the recognition in the groom's father's face speak louder than any words I could find. The man stepped closer now, his hand gripping the back of a chair as if to steady himself. His eyes shone with something raw, gratitude, reverence, guilt. "You saved my life," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the heavy air. The guests shifted, whispers rising, but he didn't care. He only looked at me. All these years, and now here you are, at my son's wedding. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even the most polished socialites at the front tables, the ones who'd laughed earlier, now leaned forward with furrowed brows. The string quartet had lowered their bows completely, their instruments silent in their laps. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. What began as a cruel prank had become something no one could ignore. I stood motionless, breathing slow, my gaze locked on the man across from me. Inside, my chest burned. Memories, grief, pride, all colliding at once. Derek shifted nervously, sweat forming along his temple. His arrogance wavered as the truth began to seep into the room. He glanced at his father, at Claire, at me, searching for some way to control the story, spiraling out of his hands. But this wasn't his story anymore. Claire's hand squeezed mine tightly. Her voice was small, trembling with fear and confusion. "Dad, please, what's going on?" Still, I said nothing, because some moments are too big for words. Some truths can only be carried in silence, in the way men stand tall after being knocked down, in the way history itself catches up no matter how long you try to bury it. Finally, the groom's father turned fully to the room. His voice, though still unsteady, carried the authority of a man who had once commanded respect. "This man," he said, pointing to me with a trembling hand, "is the reason I am standing here today. Years ago, in place none of you could imagine, I should have died. But his voice broke, and he steadied himself before continuing. He carried me out of fire. He gave me my life back." His words sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. The guests gasped again, their murmurs swelling into a roar of whispers. Claire's tears streamed freely now, her bouquet forgotten on the floor. Derek's face went pale, his lips twitching, struggling to form words. And me, I remained still, silent, my eyes fixed on the chandelier above. I wasn't thinking about recognition or vindication. I was thinking about the promise I made to my wife when she died, that I would protect our daughter, no matter what it cost me. And now here I was, watching her world begin to crumble in ways she could never have foreseen. The groom's father's voice dropped again, soft but powerful, carrying across the stunned hall. He deserves respect. He deserves honor. And tonight, he deserves more than laughter at his expense. The silence that followed was different from the first. This silence carried weight, the kind of silence that changes things, that rearranges lives. I stood tall, shoulders squared, my daughter's hand gripping mine, her tears soaking into my sleeve. I didn't need to speak. Not yet. The truth had already begun to do its work, and no amount of Derek's arrogance could stop it now. The silence that followed his declaration was unlike anything I had felt in years. It wasn't polite, it wasn't patient, it was raw, heavy, alive with the weight of truth suddenly exposed. Guests who had laughed at my fall now sat rigid, their expressions shifting from amusement to discomfort, then to shame. I could see them exchanging glances, some whispering behind hands, others lowering their eyes, as if unable to meet mine. For the first time that night, Derek's arrogance cracked. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, but the smugness was gone from his eyes. He looked not like a victor basking in glory, but like a man realizing he had made a catastrophic mistake in front of everyone who mattered. Claire clung to my arm, her tears dampening the sleeve of my suit. "Dad," she whispered again, her voice desperate. "I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell me?" My throat constricted, words pressing against my lips but refusing to come. It wasn't a story for wedding halls, for champagne glasses and crystal chandeliers. It was a story of blood and fire, of carrying men through smoke while bullets cracked overhead. It was a story I had buried because I wanted her childhood to be filled with laughter, not shadows of war. I squeezed her hand instead of answering, hoping she could feel the truth in my silence. The officiant fumbled with his notes, trying to regain order, but the ceremony had already unraveled. Guests ignored him, their focus locked on me, on Derek, on the man who had spoken with reverence and gratitude. I could feel the shift in the air. Power had changed hands without a single blow thrown. Not through money, not through arrogance, but through truth. Then Derek stepped forward, his face pale but his voice strained with forced confidence. "Dad, this is ridiculous. You can't just interrupt my wedding with some story about the past. This is about me and Claire, not him." His words fell flat, landing with the dull thud of desperation. Guests turned toward him, their expressions sharpening. The ones who had once chuckled at his cruel prank now frowned, murmuring disapproval. Derek's hands shook slightly as he pointed at me. "He's just trying to embarrass me. He's nothing more than." "Enough." His father's voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and commanding. The single word stopped Derek cold. The man who had spoken with trembling gratitude only moments before now radiated authority, his voice steady, his shoulders squared, as if stepping back into a role he hadn't worn in years. "Do you have any idea who you've humiliated tonight? Do you even understand the weight of what you've done?" Derek stammered, his eyes darting wildly across the guests, searching for support, but none came. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The whispers grew louder, carrying judgment he could no longer control. Claire's trembling intensified beside me, her hand clutching mine tighter, her lips quivering as if caught between defending her husband and acknowledging the truth unraveling before her eyes. I took a slow breath and finally spoke, my voice low but carrying through the hall. Respect isn't given through money. It's earned by how you treat people, by how you carry yourself when no one is watching. Tonight, you showed everyone who you really are. My words were simple, but I could feel them sink into the room like stones in water, rippling outward, touching every guest who had witnessed Derek's cruelty. Claire gasped softly, her tears flowing freely now, her eyes locked on Derek. Her lips parted, but still she said nothing, too torn between love and the shattering reality unfolding before her. I could see it in her face, the battle I had dreaded, the painful realization that the man she thought would cherish her had just mocked her father in front of the world. The groom's father stepped closer, his voice breaking but firm. This man saved my life. Without him, I wouldn't be here to see my son get married. Without him, Derek, you wouldn't exist. And this is how you treat him. This is the man you humiliate. His words shook the hall to its core. Gasps and murmurs erupted again, some guests covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The weight of history had been dragged into the present, and it was undeniable. I lowered my eyes briefly, the flood of memory threatening to overtake me. Sand, heat, the metallic sting of blood in the air. A body over my shoulders, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. I had carried him then, and I had carried that silence for decades. Now, in a hall of chandeliers and flowers, it all came back, not as a medal, not as glory, but as truth. The music had long since stopped. The waiters had set their trays aside, their eyes fixed on the scene. Even the children, fidgeting earlier, now sat still, sensing the gravity of what was happening. Derek's face twisted in anger and fear, the mask of charm stripped away. "You don't know him like I do," he shouted suddenly, his voice cracking. "He's just a mechanic. A bitter old man stuck in the past. He has nothing. I'm the one who's building a future with Claire." The words echoed, but they didn't land. They exposed him further. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I let the silence that followed swallow him whole. Claire's sobs broke that silence, sharp and painful. She turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Dad, is this true?" she whispered. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I reached for the chain around my neck, pulling it from beneath my shirt. Maria's ring, my wife's ring, swung gently in the light. The room hushed again, all eyes fixed on that small golden band glimmering like fire. I held it tightly in my hand, feeling its warmth, its weight. "Your mother asked me one thing before she left this world," I said, my voice trembling now, but steady enough to carry. "Protect you. Always. And that's what I've done. Sometimes that meant silence. Sometimes that meant sacrifice. And tonight, it means standing." My eyes burned, but I didn't let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Claire broke entirely, her bouquet forgotten, her makeup streaked, her body trembling as the truth settled into her chest. Guests began to rise, not in applause, not in anger, but in recognition that something far bigger than a wedding was happening before their eyes. And Derek, pale and sweating, stood alone, stripped of his performance, his arrogance revealed for what it was, weakness. The chandeliers glowed brighter, the room buzzing with energy none of us had expected. And I stood tall, my daughter's hand in mine, the weight of silence now replaced by the weight of truth. The weight of the hall pressed in on me, every eye fixed, every whisper like a gust of wind stoking flames I had tried to bury for decades. Claire's hand gripped mine so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I did not move. I stood still, rooted, as if the years of hardship, labor, and war had forged me into stone for this moment. Derek's face was red now, blotched with fury and humiliation, and his tie hung loose as though even fabric no longer respected him. He pointed at me again, his hand trembling, his voice high, and cracking like a boy who had lost his footing. "You think you can stand here and ruin my wedding with old stories? He's just a washed-up man clinging to the past. I'm the one building the future. Claire belongs with me, not him." The words, instead of sounding like confidence, fell like brittle glass shattering on marble. The guests did nod in agreement. They recoiled, exchanged glances heavy with disgust. A few even muttered under their breath, their whispers swelling into judgment that no amount of money could silence. Claire stepped toward him, tears streaking her face, but her eyes now burned with a fury I had never seen in her. "Derek, you pulled a chair from under my father on my wedding day. You humiliated him in front of everyone who raised me, who gave me everything I ever had. And you dare to stand there and claim I belong with you." Her voice shook, but it carried through the hall, striking harder than any blow. Derek flinched, his arrogance faltering under the weight of her words. He reached for her hand, desperate, but she drew back sharply, as though his touch burned. The guests shifted, some standing now, their disapproval loud in silence. The groom's father, Saul, took another step forward, his eyes locked on his son with a glare that could pierce steel. "You humiliated the man who carried me out of fire, the man who gave me the life to raise you. And you dare call yourself worthy of his daughter? You disgrace me, Derek. You disgrace this family." The room fell into a hush so absolute that even the chandeliers seemed to hold their light steadier. Derek's jaw open, closed, open again, but no words came. He was crumbling, stripped of the polished armor of charm he had worn so confidently. The very people he had sought approval from now stare at him with disdain. I could feel Claire trembling beside me, but when I looked at her, her eyes were different. Clearer, as if years of illusion had shattered in an instant. She turned to me, not as a child pleading for protection, but as a woman realizing the strength she had inherited. "Dad," she whispered, "you raised me to know the difference between cruelty and love. I see it now." She reached to her finger, tugging at the diamond ring that glittered like ice in the chandelier's glow. Slowly, deliberately, she slid it off and placed it on the table beside Derek. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed like a gavel. The gasp that followed from the guests was sharp, collective, undeniable. Derek's face drained of all color. His lips parted in horror as he whispered, "Claire, no, you can't." But she could, and she did. I stepped forward, placing myself between them, not as an obstacle, but as a shield. My voice was calm, steady, deliberate. "You wanted me on the floor, Derek. But men like me don't stay down. We rise. And we rise not to crush, but to protect. You thought respect was bought. You thought family could be owned. But what you fail to understand is simple. Dignity cannot be stolen, and love cannot be bought." My words cut the air like blades, but I didn't need to shout. The silence of the crowd carried them farther than volume ever could. Derek's knees buckled slightly, his body swaying as though he had been struck by a force larger than himself. His own father's voice was the final blow. "Leave. Now." The command rang through the hall, and Derek, desperate and humiliated, stumbled backward. The polished floor reflected his crumbling image as he pushed past the crowd, his footsteps frantic, the door swinging wide before slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was like a cleansing wind. Heavy, final. Claire collapsed into my arms then, sobbing not with shame, but with release. Guests rose, their applause swelling, not for the ruin of a man, but for the truth that had been spoken, for the dignity reclaimed. Some clapped hesitantly, some fervently, but the sound rolled through the hall like thunder. Saul turned to me, his hand gripping my shoulder with the strength of remembered debt. "I owed you my life once," he said, voice thick with emotion. "And tonight you reminded me why. You saved us all from him." His eyes glistened, his lips pressed together as he fought his own tears. "Thank you." I shook my head slightly, my hand tightening on Claire's. "No need for thanks. I kept a promise. That's all." I glanced upward, the chandeliers dazzling above, but my mind drifted to Maria, her smile, her voice, the promise I had whispered on her last day. Protect Claire always. And I had. Tonight wasn't about me. It wasn't about Saul. It wasn't even about Derek. It was about keeping that promise, about proving that no matter how hard the world tried to break us, we rise again. Claire lifted her head, her face streaked, but her eyes glowing with new strength. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Sorry I didn't see it sooner. Sorry I doubted." I kissed her forehead softly, my voice breaking but steady enough for her to hear. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Princess. Love makes us blind sometimes, but the important thing is that you see now, and you will never walk alone." The guests began to approach, one by one, their words of admiration, their apologies for having laughed, their acknowledgement of truth. Some shook my hand, others simply nodded, their faces humbled. The music never returned, the champagne lost its flavor, the flowers seemed suddenly unnecessary. What remained was something heavier, stronger, respect. Not the kind given out of fear or money, but the kind earned through silence, endurance, and truth. As Claire and I walked out of the hall together, her hand firmly in mine, the city night greeted us with cool air and glowing lights. The noise of traffic, the hum of life, felt like a balm after the storm. She leaned against me, her voice soft but resolute. "Dad, you kept your promise." I looked upward at the stars barely visible through the city glow, Maria's ring warm against my chest. "I always will," I whispered. And that's where our story ends for now. If you felt this moment, if it moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and let's keep these stories of strength and dignity alive together.